Welcome. I'm Glen Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. More than 50 years ago, the United States fought a bloody war in Korea. Half a century later, we still have 30,000 U.S. military troops stationed in South Korea, and every now and then, the United States still threatens war against North Korea. Why? What's going on? What history led up to the Korean War, and what's been happening since? It's important to understand Korean history and U.S.-Korean relations, but neither the politicians that we have nor the mainstream news media have done much to really inform us and help us understand what the background is or what's going on now. So we'll explore Korean history and U.S.-Korean relations on this TV program for this coming hour. We have one guest, Larry Kirchner, who will be helping us with a lot of information. He's been studying up on this lately and went to Korea as part of a delegation with Veterans for Peace. Larry served in the United States Army in Vietnam. He's active in Veterans for Peace. He's also active in the Fellowship of Reconciliation in our chapter in Lewis County. He's self-employed as a medical professional in Lewis County. When he became concerned about Korea, he and other Veterans for Peace members went there to find out more and to see what they could do to help. He and other members went there and supported peace activists in Korea who are trying to protect farmland from being gobbled up by expansions of U.S. military bases. So Larry, it's good to have you here on the show, and I know that the viewers and I will be learning a lot from you. There's a very old history in Korea, and we in this country just don't know it. Most Americans think about Korea in terms of the Korean War, but that was the early 1950s. But what was the old history before, say, before the 1850s?
Well, excuse me, the Koreans have been a unified people for at least 1,200 years. They've always seen themselves, not always, but at least for the last 600 or 700 years, they had seen themselves as almost a younger brother to China in a confusion, harmony type system. They have a well-developed culture. People don't realize that the Koreans were printing books with movable type 200 years before Gutenberg printed his Bible. So they have a pretty complex history and culture. They have always, if you look at a map, they sit between Japan and China, so they've always had to deal with those two countries.
They're on the mainland attached to where China is.
Exactly, and it's almost a crossroads from China to Japan. You have to go through Korea.
Yeah.
So the Koreans have always they've always seen the Japanese as either equal to or inferior to their own culture. And other than the Japanese and the Chinese, they saw all the rest of the world as barbarians and had no interest in having any interaction with them at all. In fact, in 1664, they closed their borders to all outside activity, with the exception of one trade mission to China a year.
So they were pretty much self-sufficient then. They could handle their own needs for food and clothing and whatever else they needed, and did quite well at it, sounds like.
Very
they were 200 years ahead of Gutenberg on movable type.
Exactly.
The first contact with the United States was in the 1850s. Can you tell us about that?
There were a few shipwrecked sailors, but the first official contact was a U.S. military vessel from Hawaii in 1853. It just came and sailed into the Pusan Harbor and stayed for a few days. There was no particular incident, and it left. But a few years later, there was a heavily armed U.S. military vessel carrying commercial traders in 1866, called the USS Sherman, and it sailed up the Dae-Jung River at a time when the river was highly flooded, so that it sailed all the way up to Pyongyang. Then the floods receded, and this heavy ship was stuck there. So in typical American fashion, they decided they would send out raiding parties to get supplies and to grab hostages. And
smart move. Good way to make friends.
Yes, needless to say, the Korean government of the time didn't appreciate it, and the governor of the area ordered the ship fired on and destroyed, and all of the crew members of the Sherman were killed.
And so what happened next then? There was a follow-up from the U.S.
A couple of years later, there was a ship called the Wachusett, another military vessel, came to investigate, try to find out what had happened to the Sherman. And the commander of the Wachusett, in his report, says that the Korean people were not cooperative and told them to go away. And they did, but as they left, he told the Koreans that if he left unsatisfied, there would be many ships returning to investigate things. The official Korean account is that the official that the commander of the ship was talking with told the Americans that he didn't have the authority to talk to them, and he was waiting for directions from their capital, and asked the Americans to leave, but they didn't. So there was an obvious misunderstanding right from the get-go there.
When we were preparing for the program, you gave me some background material, and there's one thing I thought was really interesting. This was from the spring of 1868, when in that follow-up, related to that follow-up thing, and where it says the Koreans wondered, and here's the quotation, right. "We've been living 4,000 years without any treaty with you, and we can't see why we shouldn't continue to live as we do."
Yes, that was in their letter, their official letter explaining what had happened to the Sherman.
Yeah. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Exactly. They saw no need to be involved with the United States or anyone else.
Yeah. Then in 1870 and 71, the United States State Department tried to negotiate a treaty about.
Yeah, we were trying to bring pressure on Korea through China. So we had our U.S. mission to Beijing trying to somehow create a situation where we could develop a treaty with Korea. They showed little interest. So in 1871, we sent a flotilla of 5 warships and landed over 1,200 soldiers on a island fortress, killing 350 Koreans, including the commander of the fortress, and 3 Americans were lost in that particular battle, if you could call it that. As soon as the Korean government found out that this was occurring, they sent their army there with modern weapons, and the Americans hightailed it out of there. Mm-hmm. And surprisingly, this didn't convince the Koreans to have a treaty with us either.
Yeah.
What finally happened was in 1876, the Japanese had a huge fleet sail to the waters of Korea and threatened Korea with invasion if they didn't sign a treaty with Japan called the Kanghwa Treaty. And once that occurred, the king of Korea at that time, Kodong, decided that it only made sense if they were going to be open to Japan to open up to the rest of the world. And in 1882, the United States signed a treaty with Korea that starts off stating that the Korean and the American peoples will have everlasting amity and friendship. And this treaty allowed for Koreans to come to America and for Americans to buy land and have a legation in Korea. The Americans were able to preach the gospel in Korea. and they also signed, as part of this, a mutual defense pact.
So like if Canada were to invade the United States and attack us, Korea would come to our assistance.
Exactly. Yeah.
But so the treaty seems, as reading the background material and hearing what you're saying, it sounds like the treaty it was forced upon them, essentially.
Essentially, although I think the force was the force of just history, because by that time it was obvious that it was impractical for any nation to totally be closed off from the rest of the world.
But then the relation with the United States was, although it sounded like it was worded in a way that's quite mutual, it was clear that
the United States probably wanted it more than the Koreans.
Yeah.
Although it's interesting because King Kodang, sitting in the middle of China, Russia, Japan, saw the United States as the country that would have the least hidden motives to be involved there. So he actually hired many Americans to be advisors and take part in his government. So the Americans, right from that point, we had a strong influence in that country.
But he figured that we had no axe to grind, so we'd be safe to bring in in those roles.
And Korea and China also saw the United States as kind of a counterbalance, because at that time militarism in Russia and Japan was rising, so they saw it as kind of an international balance too.
Okay. Now, after World War I, President Woodrow Wilson said, "Oh, okay, we got 14 points. We care about national self-determination. We're going to be on the side of democracy and freedom for people." And how did the Korean folks take to that?
I think we need to back up a little bit before that. We signed this treaty in 1882, and then in 1904 there was a war between Japan and Russia.
Right, that's right.
And as a result of that war, in which Japan defeated Russia, Japan assumed effective control of Korea and Manchuria.
Okay.
That was in 1904.
That's right.
And the United States in 1898, in the
Spanish-American War, we left that part out. Okay.
We had taken, the Cuba and the Caribbean, Spanish colonies. We had taken Guam and the Philippines, and related, we had taken over Hawaii. So we had that Pacific influence around Japan.
Yeah.
And
kind of the start of an empire is what was happening.
Exactly. If you look at America history, it's a development of the empire right from the get-go. Yeah. But that's another show.
Yeah.
So we had the political and commercial folks in place in an area that could be considered a sphere of influence of Japan, because they were the big guys on the block at that time.
That's right.
So we signed a secret agreement, despite our everlasting amity and mutual defense pact with Korea. We signed a secret agreement with Japan called the Taft-Katsura Agreement, in which we agreed that Japan would have unfettered influence in Korea and Manchuria, and they would say nothing about our being in Guam, Hawaii, and the Philippines.
Okay.
And at the same time, the Japanese signed a similar agreement with Great Britain concerning them being in India.
Okay, so a couple of big countries that have imperialistic visions sort of collaborate and carve up these little places.
Right, it was the beginning of Japan's visions of empire too.
Yeah.
So we did that to the Korean people, despite the treaty that we had signed with them.
Yeah, offering eternal friendship.
Right.
And,
so then comes along the First World War. Well, actually before that, it was at that time King Kodang was still the king of Korea. he was king for 50-some years. And in 1907, the Japanese forced him to abdicate in favor of his son, who became King Seongjong. His son had been educated in military academies in Tokyo and was very pro-Japanese. And within 3 years after assuming the throne, he signed an agreement with Japan, making Korea part of Japan, annexing Korea to Japan.
Okay.
And that gave some more legality to what the Japanese were actually already doing.
Okay. And then
So then along comes the First World War.
World War I, and when that ends, Wilson says, okay, we really care about national self-determination. You know, we don't want to have all these empires controlling these little countries. We support countries doing their own thing. And how did that go over with Korea?
Koreans thought that sounded great to them. They sent a delegation to speak with President Wilson. And at the same time, Ho Chi Minh was there in Paris or Versailles or wherever they were, asking about independence for Vietnam. But it turned out that isn't exactly what Wilson meant. What Wilson meant was that those countries that had been colonies of those countries that lost the First World War, those countries could seek independence. But if you were a colony of one of the winners, i.e. Japan and France, so Vietnam and Korea weren't up for consideration.
I see.
So Wilson said, he said, no, we won't even discuss that.
And of course, we know what happened after Ho Chi Minh was rebuffed, actually by Wilson and by later U.S. presidents, all the way up through Truman. Kept rebuffing him, and he says, well, screw you, I'll get help someplace else for independence for Vietnam. So
that was in 1918,
okay,
in February, I think. And then in March of the following year, there was a huge rise of Korean nationalism to the point where out of a population of 16 million, 2 million people, I think it was March 1st of 1919, took to the streets.
That's 1/8 of the population participated in the demonstration.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
You can imagine if we had 1/8 of the U.S. population.
All in the streets on the same
day.
Yeah, I mean, phenomenal.
Yeah,
and the Japanese just cracked down on it severely. They killed thousands, they jailed tens of thousands, and there was not one word said by the United States government.
Okay.
So finally the Korean people got the idea that they weren't going to have any support from the West despite our high-flown words.
Yeah. Now, the Korean Provisional Government got established in 1919 also in Shanghai, which is southeastern Japan, or southeastern China, I meant. So it's some distance away.
I'm not sure why except that Shanghai was a fairly international city at the time.
Yeah, with all the trade going on. Yeah.
What was happening with the Korean nationalists was when they became obvious they weren't going to get any help from the United States, they sought help from the Soviet Union. And Lenin was only too glad to help them in their struggle against the Americans. So that's how the Korean Provisional Government got developed. A lot of it was with support of the Soviets.
But the first head of the Korean Provisional Government was Syngman Rhee, who later became corrupt. And
he actually was a Korean who was living in the United States, was a doctor who had married an American woman. And the story, I didn't find a lot of documentation for it, but the story was that Lenin sent 100,000 gold coins to this group in Shanghai, and somehow Syngman Rhee disappeared at the same time these 100,000 gold coins disappeared. And so he was kicked out of the Korea Provisional Government, although he is initially their premier.
So, but there was that connection between Lenin offering help, and then the Korean attitudes toward Russian. There were a lot of Korean. There are some thousands of Koreans living in Siberia where they could get farmland.
Right, exactly. Estimated 300,000 first-generation Koreans were living in Siberia at that time. At the time of the 1917 revolution in Russia,
because that was a place where they could get some farmland to operate.
Because there's limited farmland in Korea proper. So the revolution went fairly well in Russia proper, but it was fairly chaotic in Siberia. There was the White Army there. The Americans sent a 5,000-man expeditionary force.
I think most people in this country don't realize that the United States invaded
Siberia,
Russia,
Siberia,
and fought against the Russian Revolution.
There were 70,000 Japanese soldiers, 5,000 Americans, and a few thousand of several other had this expeditionary force to try to fight or support the anti-Soviet forces that were there. Well, because the Koreans had been getting support and help from the Soviets, they tended to, they went on the Soviet side.
That was their affinity.
In fact, there was a 10,000-man Korean force that was a large part of the force that finally chased the last of the Americans out of Siberia about a year and a half later.
So from that time, from say 1910 into the midst of World War II, United States policy, based on what you had provided for me in the way of background information, the United States policy was to treat Koreans as if they were basically Japanese.
Right, exactly. And as far as they were, since there was the annexation, that they were in fact Japanese citizens.
Even though the ethnicity, the culture,
totally different.
The history is all separate because they had been annexed by Japan. We took that at face value and said, okay, they're all Japanese.
Right, because we had signed this secret agreement.
Except that we didn't send them to the concentration camps in World War II.
Well, after 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, we started seeing the Koreans in a new light. There were approximately 6,000 Koreans in the United States at that time, and once the war started, several hundred of them joined the U.S. military, mostly as translators and intelligence officers. And so in 1943, when we were sending Japanese Americans to our concentration camps, the Koreans who lived here were considered something alien status, where they basically they could live, not be in the concentration camps. So.
There was also in 1943, there was a summit in Cairo, Egypt, where the U.S. and Britain and China supported Korea's freedom, but we still kept meddling in Korea.
Yeah, we supported it in the sense that someday, by and by, they would be free. It's interesting in a way, if you think United States, Great Britain, and China. At that time, China was run by Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist Chinese. And the whole of the American idea about what was going to happen in the future in Asia was based on the fact that China would be a bulwark against the Soviet Union.
That's right.
That's one of the reasons we didn't consider Korea very important, because China was going to be our main.
That was a big buffer.
Was going to be our main guy, so it didn't matter what happened to Korea. Then we know what happened later.
But the decisions there and at Potsdam later on.
It basically was, the big guys dividing up the world without any consultation with the people who were being affected.
So it was Roosevelt and Stalin and those guys who
and then later
said, you're
Truman
here,
and
you're
Stalin,
here, you're here, you're over there.
And Roosevelt and Stalin, between them, decided that Korea would be a joint military control, like happened in Germany at the end of the war. Again, without asking the Koreans what they wanted.
Despite the treaty that we had from way back when.
Despite the treaty that we had signed with them, yes.
Okay. And then in 1945, the United States bombed Japan with nuclear weapons,
Right,
with
in
atomic bombs.
August.
And then we sliced Korea at this 38th degree parallel, that latitude line,
Right.
and that was totally an arbitrary line.
It was. The story that I heard was that the U.S. Office of War Operations or Intelligence, something like that, there was a colonel named Bonesteel and another colonel named Dulles, who later ended up head of the CIA, were given like 30 minutes to write up a document that would show how the Japanese were to surrender in various parts of Asia. And when they came to dealing with Korea, the only map they had was a little tiny wall map that you didn't see very few cities on it even, and they just arbitrarily did the 38th parallel as being the two zones between the Soviets and the Americans for that control they were talking about, without looking at where rivers were, where villages were, nothing. They just arbitrarily did that.
Now, at the beginning of this program, you said that the Korean people culturally are all one.
Culturally.
Ethnically, it's not like these civil wars we run into where you have Hutus versus Tutsis,
Right.
or
No, nothing like that.
or,
they've always been
it's
one
all
people.
And so that line at the 38th, you keep hearing, if you're paying attention, you hear about how families were divided decades ago, and they're still divided, and there's a big push for unification because we just divided families apart.
Exactly. And if you look at the propaganda that comes out of Washington over the last 50 years, you get some idea that the South Koreans are this brave, struggling, new, wonderful people, and the North Koreans are somehow kind of dark and a little bit evil, and there's certainly their leaders are madmen. It's almost like there's two different peoples, and they're not. They're one people.
It's one. Ethnically and culturally, it's
exactly.
They're all the same.
They're one person.
Yeah.
One people. Yeah.
And so that dividing line was totally arbitrary, and once again, here foreign countries are making decisions.
Exactly.
The Koreans are being excluded from.
Right, because what happened was, after the atomic bomb, it was a matter of days before Japan surrendered, and the Soviets had just barely gotten into the war in the Pacific, just less than a few weeks before that, and they honored their agreement they were the only troops in the area. They came down through North Korea. They honored their agreement. They stopped at the 38th parallel. And didn't go any farther, where they could have easily, taken over the whole of the country, because there were no American troops there for almost a month. During that month, the Koreans in North and South Korea developed trade unions. They took over factories. They started producing things. They developed an actual government, the Korean People's Government. It was maintaining order and production. It was a representative government that included both leftists and conservatives. The conservatives agreed to take part because they were afraid the Soviets were going to come down, and then they wouldn't have anything. So that was one of the reasons they were in it. But it was a government that their programs called for distribution of the land that had been taken from the Japanese and the collaborators, distribute that to the peasants. They called for nationalization of major national industries. They called for basic human rights, free speech, freedom of religion,
and equal rights for
equal
women.
rights
They
for
prohibited
women,
child labor.
no child labor law. Everyone would have the vote. And they also stated that their function was to have good relationships with the United States. That was one of the things they wanted to do.
So it sounds like it was very grassrootsy, very democratic, very egalitarian, very much committed to social justice, fairness, sharing the resources.
And this government was in both North and South. The same government was in the part that the Soviets had control of, and then there was the South, which for a month the Koreans had control of.
Yeah. So that was the unification again.
Exactly.
They were already. They'd solved the problem.
Exactly. There was no problem.
Yeah.
Until the Americans got there.
Yeah. And so what did the United States do then?
Then the Americans showed up, and
this would be when then?
1945.
Okay. And later on, then.
Right.
Sure.
It wasn't long after.
Shortly after the end of the war.
It was like December of 45.
Yeah.
You know.
Okay.
So they came in. They declared that government, the Korean People's Republic, to be illegal.
Even though that was
the real government.
National self-determination.
Because they recognized that it was socialist oriented. It was for the people.
Yeah.
So the United States made that illegal. They created the South Korean government, which we know today, the Republic of South Korea.
Yeah.
They put Syngman Rhee in charge.
Yeah.
They created the government. They created the legislature that became the South Korean legislature, and it consisted of 50% were people that the American military commander appointed, and the other 50% were elected, but he could veto them if he didn't like them.
Wow.
That was their government, and the government basically consisted of pro-American, pro-capitalist bureaucrats and large landowners who had been collaborators with the Japanese.
Yeah, so not a strong national base.
In fact, the man who was in charge of the Republic of Korea military in the South had worked with General Tojo of the Japanese Army.
Oh.
Every single officer in the Army at that time had been in the Japanese Army.
Well, it's like what we did to Vietnam after the war.
Right.
The Vietnamese people have been struggling for decades to get free from the French colonial empire, and after World War II, the United States gave Vietnam back to the French.
Right.
The Japanese had occupied it, and we said, no, this goes back to the French again. The people said, wait a minute, we wanted to be free. We wanted to have democracy. And we said, shut up, you're under the control of the French again.
Yeah.
And then the United States was funding the French war to keep the Vietnamese people down and keep that part of the French Empire.
Right.
Until 1954 with Dien Bien Phu, when the French lost, but the United States was already paying 80% of the French cost of the war by 1954.
So it was our war already.
So it's a recurring pattern. It's not like an aberration, like, golly, what went wrong? It's like, this is the way the United States was operating, and still do. I mean, we installed puppet governments in Afghanistan and Iraq too.
Yeah. We'd like to in Iran.
And, that's next. How did the Korean people react to this?
Needless to say, they were upset. There was guerrilla uprisings all through the South. The Soviets in the North continued to let the people run the government exactly how it had been set up in the North, at least initially. In the South, there was uprisings everywhere. It's estimated that somewhere between 50 and 100,000 South Koreans were killed, either by the Americans directly or the South Korean army directed by the Americans. At the end of 1949, there was between 30 and 40,000 political prisoners in jail. They made it illegal to strike. They just totally destroyed all of the people's organizations that were there.
Now, what we think of as the Korean War began when fighting broke out in June of 1950.
It actually started the previous year. There were skirmishes back and forth.
Okay. So how did this come about? What was going on with there?
There were a couple of areas that were considered strategic in terms of controlling larger areas, and one of the main areas was just north of the 38th parallel, and the South Korean army had gone there, been pushed back. They'd gone back and forth several times, and there's pretty good evidence that although American official propaganda blames the North Koreans for having started the fighting that became the Korean War, there's pretty clear evidence that actually was the South Koreans who had invaded that part of the North that started it. there in 1950.
Now, Syngman Rhee was still
He was the president
running
at that
that,
time.
and he was sort of like the United States guy, the guy that we put in there.
Exactly.
And he continued to be corrupt.
He continued to be corrupt. He also was actually more than we bargained for in some ways, because whenever there was an opportunity to settle things with the North, he didn't want to do that. He wanted to totally overrun the North. He didn't, later on when there was talk about peace, he didn't do any of that. In fact, the United States had to threaten him that they would take him out if he didn't go along with the program.
Okay.
So, but he was a corrupt leader, and later on was thrown out of office for corruption and embezzlement in 1961, I think.
Yeah. And then after 1961, then there's a series of military coups where some general would overthrow the government and say, I'm the new head honcho here.
And then the Korean CIA would assassinate him.
Right. And so they had a succession of these. And the United States CIA had set up the Korean CIA, and they were doing all kinds of skullduggery. In the 80s, for quite a number of years, I used to get a publication called the Monthly Review of Korean Affairs. And it would be taking you through what the ins and outs of all this skullduggery and the politics of it, and the people's desire to have democracy. But when you have democracy, they'd repress you, and they'd throw you in jail, or they'd torture you, or people get assassinated, or this or that or whatever. But it was quite an interesting thing. But the United States CIA and the Korean CIA were just up to their ears in all this stuff. Then you had a bunch of coups where one general after another would overthrow the government. And finally, they ended up with somebody who actually cares about democracy.
Right. 1997 was the first time an opposition leader actually was elected in South Korea, and that was Kim Dae-Jung.
Yeah. And he was somebody who really cared about democracy and reunification.
And reunification. All of the polls and studies that have been done through this whole period of time showed that reunification was the prime interest of the Korean people.
Yeah, North and South.
North and South.
Yeah, that's what they wanted, was
And
reunification.
Kim Dae-Jung came with what he called the Sunshine Policy, and that involved opening up to the North, trade, develop families, being able to interact, railroads.
Yeah, they had plans set up to be able to relink the rail lines and
Exactly.
things.
Yeah.
I want to just check back to U.S. military bases there. After the Korean War, we didn't say, well, we're done with this, we're going to go away.
No.
We have, you've told me before the show that the U.S. has more than 700 military bases around the world, including more than 100 in South Korea.
In South Korea, yeah.
And
Chalmers Johnson actually says it's closer to 1,000 military bases around the world. So.
And we're still doing what we had done before, which is throw the farmers off their land, take the farmland, and expand U.S. military bases.
That's how I actually got to Korea. September of '06, there was a group of Korean Veterans for Peace who had come to our national convention and invited a delegation of Americans to come over and witness what was going on. And then there was a group of a consortium of various Korean activist groups had gotten together in support of these farmers, and they also invited us to come over.
You have a poster from that
actually,
effort.
this.
Yes, that's the one. Then we'll show the other poster in a moment as well.
This is one of the little grannies who
We
was
want to
being
watch the glare. Tilt a bit there. Good.
who was being thrown off of her land. In 1941, I think, in this area, this is called Pyeongtaek, which is in southern South Korea, and it's famous for the rice that's produced there. Well, in 1941, the Japanese put a military base there and kicked these farmers off their property to build the base with no compensation. So after the war in 1953, the United States thought, well, this is a good spot for a military base because it's right on a harbor, good airfield, So in 1953, we decided to double the size of the base that the Japanese had. So we kicked these farmers off their land. Again, no compensation. So recently, as part of Bush's strategic reevaluation around the world of where our forces would be, they decided they would give back 34 of these bases to the South Korean government. But in return, they wanted to triple the size of this base. So they kicked 3,000 people like her off of their property so that they could triple the size of Camp Humphreys, which is south of Seoul.
Show us the other poster as well.
We have a weekly vigil in Centralia, and this is what I've been keeping lately there, just to point out the fact that the Chinese left Korea in 1958, and we still have 30,000 troops there. It's just typical of our imperialism.
Yeah. Now, let's see. After Kim Dae-Jung, now there's another president now, Roh Moo-hyun.
Yeah.
And what's he like, and what's he up to?
He's fairly liberal too. He was elected with the idea of continuing the things that Kim Dae-Jung wanted to do,
including working toward reunification.
And just recently, I think about 3 months ago, 2 months ago, President Bush was in Australia at some kind of a meeting, and President Roh went up to him and said, "What are you going to do to help us reunify?" And Bush was apparently taken back and didn't know what to say, kind of downplayed it. But since then, I think we should look back a little bit. The North Koreans have felt threatened by America right from the get-go, from the back to the war.
Right.
The Americans made it known that they had a battle doctrine called the Air-Land Battle Doctrine, which included the use of first-strike nuclear weapons against North Korea.
Yeah. And we've threatened North Korea many times over the decades with nukes.
President Truman, even during the during the Korean War, signed orders allowing the use of nuclear weapons against the North Koreans. Fortunately, the weapons never got any farther than Guam, but that was a possibility because MacArthur wanted to use them.
Yeah.
But we had nuclear weapons on Korean soil for 40 years. And it was only in 1991 when the first President Bush was convinced of the tactical efficacy of the smart bombs that they used in the first Gulf War, as opposed to the dirtiness of nuclear weapons. They decided he would pull all of the nuclear weapons the United States had around the world back to the United States. So they pulled all the nuclear weapons out of North Korea. But North Korea had been felt threatened by this for all those years, and they developed a huge number, estimated 15,000 large underground military structures throughout North Korea.
But we still continue to threaten any place in the world with nuclear weapons. We just don't have them based in those countries.
Exactly.
But we still can shoot them, and that's what Trident nuclear submarines are all about, is get out to the ocean and you can go thousands of miles and hit your target. So we're still threatening them.
So
now, when we hear about North Korea in the news nowadays, mostly it's about North Korea's big threat about their nuclear weapons. Can you tell us what they've been doing? And we're starting to run short on time, so if we can keep tight on things.
The North Koreans saw that when President Bush invaded Iraq, they were one of the three axes of evils, and the countries that he didn't,
which made no sense from a policy standpoint. There's not an axis. They're not an ally with Iraq or Iran. It was just a slogan that somebody threw into his speech.
But Bush attacked the one of those three that was the weakest militarily.
Yeah.
And the Koreans, it wasn't too difficult to figure out that if they had nuclear weapons, they would be in a better position to deal with the United
yeah.
States. So they developed some nuclear weapons. It's estimated they may have 8. They also have, they're fairly well known for their rockets that they, intercontinental ballistic missiles, although it'd be hard to reach. They could reach Alaska, but not much more. So they developed that. So that gave them a bargaining position. And more recently, the Bush administration has finally decided that diplomacy, and I'm assuming this is Condoleezza Rice's influence, that diplomacy would maybe work in this situation. So there's been 6-party talks in Beijing with China, Russia, Japan, U.S., North and South Korea. And North Korea has agreed to give up all of their nuclear weapons. They've agreed to give up the plutonium. They've agreed to shut down the nuclear processing facilities and nuclear reactors that they have. In return, the United States is supposed to provide oil, supposed to provide light water reactors, which you can't turn into to weapons grade stuff. So that's looking like it may happen. Exactly the same agreement was made with Korea in 1994.
I was just going to say that this sounds like what Clinton had arranged for that.
Exactly the same thing.
In the early 90s.
In 1994.
Okay.
But because the Republicans controlled Congress, Newt Gingrich
They
scuttled
stopped it. Yeah,
so it
that's
never
right.
happened.
Okay.
So all of this could have happened 10
Yeah,
years.
it was
or
the
12
problem
years
was
before.
solved until Newt Gingrich
Right.
did the hardline thing
Right.
and prevented Clinton's solution from
So
going ahead.
anyway, that's looking pretty good. Like supposedly by the end of this year, the North Koreans will have done all that. And just recently, the president of South Korea and the leader of North Korea, Kim Il-jung, met personally, and they are engaged in steps toward reunification of the country. They together have sent a resolution to the United Nations asking for the United Nations to help them develop this ability to reunify the country.
Now, some years ago, Jimmy Carter, after he had been president, was involved in helping something.
That happened in 1994.
That was part of the Clinton thing?
Right, because the United States started, under Clinton, started to have some dialogue with the North Koreans. Then the South Korean president at that time was very conservative. He kind of scuttled that. So the North Koreans decided they'd up the ante. So they shut down their reactors. They pulled the rods, put them in the cooling tanks. Or no, the first thing they did was they pulled out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
I was just going to ask you about the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
So that kind of raised the ante a little bit.
Yeah.
And then, so the United States started developing war plans, and we almost were at war at that time with North Korea, and people don't realize that.
Yeah, it was.
And then the North Koreans pulled the rods and put them in the cooling tanks, and it was getting so frantic, former President Carter realized what was happening. So he, instead of trying to talk to these people, he flew to Pyongyang and personally met
in North Korea.
In North Korea, met with Kim Jong-il, no, Kim Il-jung, anyway.
Yeah, the head guy.
Kim. And on CNN, basically, held this negotiations between, because he did it publicly so that the governments couldn't hide what was going on. And this created an opening for Clinton to have negotiations which took place in Geneva, and it led to that agreement in 1994 that should have settled things at the time.
But Gingrich and the Republicans in the House
and then
stopped it.
And then at the very end of Clinton's administration, he had plans at that time to fly to Pyongyang himself and meet with Kim Jong-il, and probably could have settled things then, but that was, as you recall, that was when the Supreme Court was about to give the presidency to the coup to Bush.
Stop counting the ballots.
So Clinton didn't feel like he could leave the country at that time, and then suddenly the North Koreans had to deal with Bush, who called the leader of North Korea an evil pygmy. I mean,
that's not a very diplomatic or a very mature thing. An evil pygmy.
That's what he called it.
Yeah. Okay. When you mentioned the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and this was a treaty that we've talked about in this program off and on over the years, in about 1969, the nations of the world reached this deal that says, okay, we got nuclear weapons. We don't want to have nuclear weapons proliferate into additional countries. So let's work out this grand bargain that says the countries that don't have nuclear weapons agree not to get them, and the countries that do have nuclear weapons agree to really work quickly toward abolishing them. That was in 1969.
Right.
And the United States has just been escalating, for many years since then. We made some progress, and now Bush wants to get more nukes going. And, the United States is in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and yet when a country like North Korea says, we're going to back out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the United States points a self-righteous finger at them and says, shame on you, not realizing that we've been out of compliance since 1969.
And we're pointing the finger at Iran,
Iran,
who is in complete compliance.
Iran is in compliance. What they're doing with nuclear stuff is allowed.
Exactly.
And they allow inspectors in. Iraq had allowed inspectors in, and they were actually in compliance.
Right.
And the weapons inspectors were not finding anything.
But we don't find too many weapons inspectors in Israel or in the United States.
Right. Israel has nuclear weapons.
Right.
They're in violation. The United States has been in violation for decades.
Right.
And so there's this very different, thing. Is there anything else you want to say about Kim Dae-Jung and that movement from 1998 or the successors?
No, just that like I say, all the polls in Korea show that the reunification is a strong
On both North and
North
South.
and South, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an important.
They have to find a way to do it that doesn't overwhelm the economy of the South, like happened with East and West Germany.
Yeah, where one side has become so poor.
It has to be managed better than that was, but
Yeah.
the desire is there, and I'm actually pretty hopeful.
Yeah. Now, what you've got, you've been involved with Veterans for Peace, and you got your Veterans for Peace shirt on.
Right.
I don't know if people can read the logo from there, but it's a VFP shirt.
Yeah, I'm a member of the Veterans for Peace Korea Peace Group.
Okay.
And
there is a page actually on the Veterans for Peace website.
website. We'll give you a lot of information
I'll read,
on it.
and I'll read what that says here so people can check it out, and then it'll appear in white lettering at the end of the show as well. But I'll read it now. It's www.veteransforpeace.org and /Korea.vp.html. So the Veterans for Peace really is trying to make sense. Because I'm not aware of other main peace groups doing much on Korea.
There are some Asian activist groups that are working in that area, but not much.
In the U.S.?
In the U.S.
Okay.
There's some activity around the Korean free trade stuff too.
Oh, yeah.
But one of the things that we're attempting to do at Veterans for Peace, it's a little of a long shot at the moment, but we're hoping to be able to set up a peace conference in North Korea next year that will bring Chinese, North and South Korean, and United States veterans together to talk about peace and reconciliation.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
And you went there when?
I went in September of '06.
Okay.
And we were there about 10 days.
Okay.
And got to speak in front of a crowd of 20,000 one day.
It's interesting that there are things happening in these countries. I know the Fellowship of Reconciliation in Japan is active, doing things, trying to protect the peace perspective there, which despite the pressure of the U.S. to get them to be more militarized. Can you give us any closing thought for just a brief period of time here, and then we'll wrap this up?
I think that I have hopes that the Korean people will be able to settle their own future, and once that becomes more real, there will be absolutely no reason for the United States to maintain 30,000 troops occupying the country. If you think back, first the Japanese and then the Americans, the country of Korea has been militarily occupied for over 100 years. They need to be able to develop their own future and their own culture.
Well, thanks. I appreciate the information you've shared with us. The Cold War raged from the middle to late 1940s up to about 1990 or so. And since then, it's continued as a conflict between the United States government and nations that our government thinks are too far left, like Cuba or Venezuela. When I was young, people were just terrified about the communist menace and Red China. And China still says it's communist, but they really practice a very bold capitalism. And it's a major U.S. trading partner, even though they're still nominally communist. The Cold War still plays out in Korea. The United States had arbitrarily divided that in two decades ago. For some reason, the United States government is still stuck in a Cold War mentality regarding Korea. The U.S. military still occupies South Korea. The CIA and the Korean CIA have a long and nasty past. We just need to learn how to get along with the North. We need to let the Koreans, as Larry says, solve their own problems, which they actually want to do. So we can make progress on this, and I want to thank Larry for sharing information with us. For information about a variety of issues relate to peace, social justice, contact the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. We're all one human family. We all share one planet. We can make the world a better place, but we all have to do our part, and the world needs what you have to offer. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.